a lot of ground to cover, a lot of things to talk about and get into this week on the College Football Podcast. I'm going to start with the Shedeur Sanders draft situation. I'm going to tier rank the ACC. Going to go over some brief NFL draft results. I'm going to talk about why I think that this may be Lane Kiffin's biggest test in this upcoming season and get into the best out-of-conference matchups in Week 2. I found that as much as I like college football, the fact that that's my favorite sport, I've never been a big NFL guy. I always, I watch the Super Bowl. I watch some of the, the playoff games are always fun. There's some regular season games, mostly the primetime matchups that I watch. Bet on them, prop bets or, whatever. They're fun to get into. I love fantasy football, but I've never been a big watcher of the NFL like I am college football. But I have found that, as much as I love college football, as much as I watch it, it is fun to every year, with each passing year, the more I kind of like the NFL because the more I focus on college football, the longer I do that, I watch those players get drafted, go into the NFL, and then it's kind of fun, to watch the continuation of their career as the players that you watch in college start to take over the rosters in the NFL. It's really made the NFL each year a little more fun for me to watch than the year past. Typically, I'll watch the draft like the first round, maybe, and then, I'll catch some, if my, favorite team has a player that's drafted somewhere else, I'll go maybe watch the clip of them, having their name called. But typically after the first round, it's just highlights and, just kind of little spots, clips here and there of stuff that happened. But this past draft, I watched all 3 days of it, and I've never done that before. The first round I was glued to it. The second round and the third round on Friday, I thought, I just had a lot of fun and I really enjoyed that. And then Saturday, I just I didn't watch it as closely. I had it on passively, but it was something that was on the TV all day. And one of the reasons was the Shedeur Sanders situation that I think was kind of blown out of proportion. A lot of that has to do with the fact that who Shedeur is, where he comes from. So the first thing I wanted to say is that I don't think that it's that crazy of a situation to have him drafted in the 5th round. It's where he wound up. He was projected by the media to be a first rounder. He's a good to above average, college quarterback. He's very raw though, but teams who needed a starting QB, if you think about that just right off the bat, there's not a lot of teams this round that needed to take a quarterback for a starter. There's only a small handful of them, and in the first round that was Titans, the Giants, and if you're taking a quarterback after that, maybe the second round there'll be a starter, but anything after that, traditionally it's a backup that you're going to be taking. Maybe that backup works his way one day into a starting role, but right off the bat as a rookie, that's kind of where you're placing them. That's where you're projecting them, is to be a backup. So Shedeur Sanders got drafted by the Browns in the 5th round. It was something that caught a lot of steam, a lot of heat on social media. A lot of, people that cover the draft, famously Mel Kiper and his meltdowns all weekend long was something fun to watch. But did you watch Shedeur at Colorado? That's the first question. He's a very raw quarterback. He's talented. He, can make some sensational plays, but he also made some pretty catastrophic plays. Like I said, he's not refined by any stretch of, the imagination. He has a lot of developing to do. He has a good skill set that under the right, coaching and tooling, as long as he, puts his head down and focuses, he's going to develop into a good quarterback in the NFL. But he's very raw. There's a lot of talk about, and the more I look into this, hear about it, talk to people, it seems to be true that there was just a lot of the slide, as we're calling it, from Shedeur Sanders was because of his interviews, the way that he acted, his ill-preparedness in his interviews with teams turned a lot of them off. There's a lot of teams that were wanting to take a quarterback 3rd round that he wasn't even on their board. And we obviously saw that, but the QB room he's going into, he probably got drafted to the worst place you could get drafted to, and that of the Cleveland Browns. the QB room he's going to be in. Joe Flacco is probably, he's the veteran, probably the projected starter. One thing is, just because you're a first rounder, by the way, doesn't mean that you're going to be a franchise quarterback. Kenny Pickett is also there in Cleveland, and he's a former first rounder. Dylan Gabriel obviously was drafted in this past draft, the same in round 3. Shedeur, he's probably at the bottom of their depth chart, so it's probably going to be him and Gabriel fighting for that third spot, depending on how Kenny Pickett performs in their competition. They maybe him and Dylan Gabriel are both there in Cleveland this year, but one of them is likely going to get cut, and by all accounts, it doesn't sound like Shedeur has really helped himself, kind of with this off the field stuff. Nothing scandalous, but it's just his focus isn't fully on football like a lot of teams, want him to. He's got, social media influencer stuff of the production company. I'm not going to get into all of it, but there's a lot of stuff that he has his focus on off the field that, maybe it may not play into, maybe not hold him back, but it's not going to help propel him forward. So I don't think it's that crazy of a thing for him to slide. If he is as talented and as dedicated as he, likes to present himself as, and he's going to make some form of career, he'll be around for a while in the NFL. Even a quarterback that isn't a franchise starter. There's quarterbacks like Jameis Winston that have been around for a long time, and they were never really got to creep into that seat of franchise. The face of the franchise, the starting quarterback. They've just kind of been a perennial backup overall. So I think that that's probably the best case scenario for Shedeur. Maybe I'm wrong, but like I said earlier, he's a very raw quarterback. He needs a lot of refinement, and I'm not so sure that he's willing to put in the work to do that, but perhaps I'm wrong. Tier ranking programs. This week we're going to go through the ACC. Last week we hit on the Big Ten a little bit, so the criteria here, it's important to establish that. So recent success in conference, that's something, and that kind of plays in with your trajectory. What have you done lately? How's the team moving? What's the roster look like? Resources and support from the athletic department, the fans, the boosters. So it's important to establish the criteria so that you understand kind of how these tiers are ranked, where that comes from. So tier 1, I've got Clemson and Florida State. So it's a little, Florida State obviously had their, a terrible year last year, but with the year prior, they won the ACC. I think they should have made the playoffs. I'm sure they'll all agree with that. They went undefeated, won their conference. I think you should be in the playoffs. Back when it was, the last year of the 4-team. With last year, it's, some people, I'm sure I'll get disagreement, in the tier 1 category, but I think that it's kind of really just kind of off of the year they had the year prior where they won the conference is what has them there, that recent success. So what happens this year, their trajectory, I think it's kind of hard to tell. I'm trying to look in this off season. I'm trying to kind of go glass half full, hope for the best in a perfect world in their eyes. What are they going to do? I think that, progress isn't always linear. So unless they have a terrible season this year, I think that they're still going to be, a tier 1 caliber program. But just those 2 teams in tier 1. Tier 2, I've got Miami, Louisville, and SMU. SMU's first year in the conference, they were, jolted in, made the conference championship game, lost on a last-second field goal. I think that that's a good starting point for them. I don't think I can put them in tier 1 just because their lack of history in the conference. I think that their trajectory also, SMU's is a little wishy-washy. It's kind of hard to get a read on, with the first year with their recruiting rankings and the way that they do that. They're going to need to develop their players to, because they don't recruit as at high of a level as the tier 1 teams do in this conference. So Miami, I think that their trajectory is probably pretty good, assuming that the transfer additions that they have play out well. They've speaking of linear success, they've kind of been on that path with Mario Cristobal there. They started, I think his first year was 5-7, and then they went either 7-5 or 8-4 the next year, maybe they won 9 games. I can't quite remember, but this past season they won 10 games. Obviously had the number one pick at Cam Ward, so but I think that their trajectory is still good. They replaced him with Carson Beck. They've done, a lot of portal additions. They've recruited really well. So I think that Miami, their trajectory is there. Uh, Louisville, kind of same deal. I think this one, tier two, a lot of that's based on trajectory there and the resources that they're committing to the program. Tier three, I got Georgia Tech, Duke, NC State, and North Carolina and Pitt. Georgia Tech, this is a big one for trajectory. I think that they're going to have a really good year this year. Their success, they've since Britt Key has got there and started. They've kind of upped the recruiting standard. They've had more success on the field. Even games they don't win, they're highly competitive. They pushed Georgia to the bitter end last year, going to multiple overtimes. So I think that their trajectory is really high. And I think that they have the opportunity to elevate to the second tier this year. Duke, they've since Mike Elko, the transition from Mike Elko to Manny Diaz was a pretty smooth one. There was not really much fall off there as far as wins and losses go. NC State, North Carolina, and Pitt, these teams are harder to get a read on, especially North Carolina. I mean, with Bill Belichick there. And by the way, that recent interview with that he did, if you're a North Carolina fan, I probably wouldn't watch that. But Bill Belichick, it's a complete wild card. There's no doubt that he's a good football coach, but is he past his prime? Will the success in the NFL translate to college? Those are, some of the main questions I would have around Bill Belichick. But it wouldn't shock me either way. If they went out and had a 10-win season or went 4-8, honestly, neither of those situations would shock me. So, tier 4 for the ACC to wrap it up here. I've got Boston College, Virginia Tech, Cal, Stanford, Virginia, Wake Forest, and Syracuse. Not a ton to be said about these. I think Syracuse is probably the one in this tier 4 that is on the right path, threatening to elevate more than the others. Boston College, I could probably put in that category with the way that they played last year with Bill O'Brien there at head coach. But Fran Brown at Syracuse, they go off and immediately pop a 10-win season. They are replacing a quarterback and, some pieces on the D-line. But I think that Syracuse, as long as, he continues to kind of keep that positive trajectory going, then they, I think, can probably elevate to tier 3 in the next year or so. But that's the ACC for you. Which conference should I do next week? The SEC, Big 12? Let me know. Just wanted to brush over some NFL draft results real quick. If it's pretty obvious now more than ever that the Big Two in college football, SEC and the Big Ten. Round 1, SEC had 15 players drafted. The Big Ten had 11. Both the ACC and the Big 12 had 2. The Mountain West had 1 player. That was Ashton Jeanty. Missouri Valley Football Conference, they also had 1 from the North Dakota State there. Total for the draft, for the entire draft, all 7 rounds, the SEC had 79 players drafted. It's a new record. The previous was 65. The Big Ten had 71. So those two conferences combined accounted for 58% of the total players drafted. The ACC had 42 players. The Big 12 had 31. The Mountain West had 6 players drafted. I won't get into all the other, smaller conferences and FCS conferences, but the Notre Dame also had 6. Since they're an independent, I figured I'd throw them in there. The top teams, if you're curious, from the SEC, Georgia had the most players drafted at 13. In the Big Ten, that was Ohio State, who had 14 players drafted. Georgia had 13. Ohio State had 14. Miami in the ACC had 7 players. There was a 4-way tie in the Big 12. Colorado, Iowa State, Arizona, and Oklahoma State. They had 4 players drafted from each of those schools. The Mountain West, it was Boise State. They had 2 players drafted. So all that does is it illustrates the players from these conferences. The NFL sees obviously what we all see, and that's that the SEC and the Big Ten, that's home to the best players in college football. the best programs, the best players, they are in those two conferences. That's not to say that there's not other talented players elsewhere. Obviously there is, but the Mountain West, the Boise State had 2 players drafted, Georgia had 13. So, I mean, these are just breeding grounds for NFL players in the SEC and the Big Ten. And it's not really the way that the sport's going. That's not really going to change anytime soon. It doesn't seem like. Hopefully, with some revenue sharing, we may be able to get some more competitive balance, uh, be more like a salary cap, kind of like what we have in the NFL. But as of right now, the SEC and the Big Ten are just cleaning house when it comes to how many of their players are getting drafted. And it's crazy too, because a lot of these teams they just reload, they don't rebuild. So, but I won't spend too much more time on this. I just wanted to go over some brief results. I think it's interesting to kind of see how things play out there. But there you have it. Make sure you follow the podcast, subscribe on YouTube. You can find me Campus Pigskin on Instagram or X. But if you're enjoying it, then follow me there and we can interact more. It's fun. Let's talk Lane Kiffin. When you think Lane Kiffin, what do you think? He's definitely an interesting personality. He's a coach that's, kind of like no other, the way he interacts with the public. Lane Kiffin, I think that this year for Lane Kiffin is probably his biggest test as a coach, at least that he's had at Ole Miss. So Lane Kiffin has unlocked the potential of Ole Miss. He's elevated the way that program is viewed and what their potential is viewed as. He's raised the bar there. So if you're talking about types of programs, I think that there's 4 different types of programs. You have your tier 1 perennial contenders like Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State. You have your tier 2 window programs. So programs that kind of they build up and then they pop, a big season or a series of seasons and then, win the championship. So think like Michigan from a couple years ago. They had built up and their window was 2023 and they win the national championship. It's kind of a window program. Michigan has the potential to be a perennial contender, but, recently they have not been that. But tier 3, you'd have, I'd say, consistent performers. So, and that's for better or for worse. So think Vanderbilt on one end and Penn State on the other. So Vanderbilt consistently performs poorly. Penn State consistently performs well, but they can't get over that, that peak, So maybe talking about these in tiers may not be the best way to do this, and then you have your wild cards. So every year, say Texas A&M, they are it's a popular thing to look at them as the dark horse or a wild card. Every year someone is talking about them in that regard, and it's because of the talent and the resources that they have there. Everyone sees, you can clearly be, a perennial contender with the level of fan support, the facilities, the recruiting, the NIL. Like there's a lot there. Everything you need to win is there. They just haven't done it. And so they're kind of every year looked at as a dark horse for that reason, because any year we all know that they could bite, but they just don't. So they're kind of a wild card where one year, they're going to go 8-4 or 5-7. They're, relatively consistent in that, but, they could always, do much more than that. So always a few plays away. So Lane Kiffin has kind of elevated Ole Miss from the wild card to consistent performer on the negative side of things to, I would say, this past year was their window. So I think he's elevated up to a window program where they spend a couple of years building up, go all in one year on the portal. This is our year. Let's go win a title. Let's push for the SEC championship, whatever it is. And I think this season he has the opportunity to show what he's capable of truly as a coach and potentially push them into the perennial contender. And perennial contender, I put Bama and, Georgia, Ohio State in that category. It doesn't mean necessarily that you're winning the title every year. It's just that every year in every year you're in the conference championship. You're just on the outside. You're the third team in the conference. Just missed, one play in one game cost you a shot to go play for the conference title. But you're there every year. Penn State's kind of like that. I put them as a consistent performer, but I guess you could also say that they're a perennial contender in that regard. But he has the chance, I think, to elevate this program even higher to being in the picture for Atlanta every year in the SEC. So it's a thing around. So Ole Miss under Lane Kiffin. Well, let's start here. So between 1971 and 2015, Ole Miss head coaches had 3 10-win seasons. That's between 1971 and 2015. They had 3 10-win seasons or more. Lane Kiffin in the last 4 years has had 10-win seasons in each of those seasons, in the 3 of the last 4. So from what took them 40, 50 years to accomplish prior to Lane Kiffin, he's done that just in the last 4 years when it comes to win totals. What does the future look like? Are they going to be a window program? This year, let's see. How are they going to replace the lack of production? The depth and the development is going to be tested there. He could be one of the best coaches in college football after this. I think that he's starting to be talked about as kind of an under-the-radar, best coach in the sport that no one really realizes or recognizes. But this year, I think if he goes out and he pops, say another 10-win season, I think he's going to be looked at as one of the best, widely as one of the best coaches in the sport. They have, some of the biggest games, I'm not going to go through the whole schedule, but they do play LSU, they go to Georgia, to Oklahoma, they play Florida, and they've got Tulane in the out-of-conference, so that's just some of their tougher matchups. The returning production, so it's going to be a big test because they're 113th in the country. They do have the third-ranked portal class. I did not update that from the close of the spring window, but their average recruiting ranking is 20th. So, like I said, this is going to be a big year to test the development of those players. The talent's going to be, the depth is going to be tested. I will say this. I didn't care much for Lane Kiffin for a long time, frankly, until the Theo Vaughn podcast from a couple weeks ago. Lane Kiffin, if you don't know, he was on Theo Vaughn's podcast, and I listened to it. It was actually a really good listen. If you are interested, you should go listen to it. He gave some good insights into coaching and from life, kind of from his perspective, and there's a couple Easter eggs in there about what it's like to be a coach in the SEC. So if you're interested, then it's a really good podcast to listen to. But until then, I didn't care much for him. Honestly, since listening to that, I'm kind of becoming a fan of Lane Kiffin's. But this year, I think it's a bigger prove-it year for Lane Kiffin than last year was, just because of all the extra work he's going to have to do to replace that production. So I'm excited. I think that they could have a really good season, but like I said, it's going to be a big test. Out-of-conference matchups, I always love talking about these because of how rarely, some of these matchups that we have. There's a couple in. So week 2 coming up this year, there are a couple matchups that we're going to have that have only happened one time before in history of college football. But we did week 1 last week, so I'm going to go through some week 2, some of the best out-of-conference matchups through this coming, season. So I'll start here. Arizona State plays at Mississippi State. Michigan plays at Oklahoma, Vanderbilt at Virginia Tech, Iowa at Iowa State, or Oklahoma State at Oregon, Illinois at Duke, and Baylor at SMU. So what do I think about these? So there's a couple things to get into here. So Arizona State and Mississippi State. This is going to be a big test for both teams. It's going to be, Mississippi State, have they improved? They're going to be playing probably, what going into the season will be the number 1 team in the Big 12. So how has Mississippi State improved, if they have at all, from last year? Is Arizona State going to continue the success? Are they going to be right back in the picture this year for the conference title and the playoff? I think that, depending on, it may not be the best thing when we look back. Mississippi State could, be terrible, and we'll look back and say, that game, of course, they blew them out of the water. But but it's a good, kind of test for both teams. Michigan at Oklahoma. So this is a unique matchup. That's why it's going to have a lot of interest. They have only played one time before. So in 1976, Michigan and Oklahoma played. Oklahoma won. That's the only time that they have played in football. So that's going to be, all eyes are going to be on them, in Norman week 2. Vanderbilt at Virginia Tech, that's going to be a good measuring stick game. You're both kind of, you got your two teams at the bottom of each conference, the SEC and the ACC. So how's Vanderbilt match up to Virginia Tech? Do they beat them again? Do they, is Vanderbilt going to kind of continue on what they started last year with Diego Pavia and everything? So Iowa at Iowa State, it's going to be a fun early season rivalry. It's always fun to watch that game. It's in Ames this year. So Oklahoma State at Oregon. So this is also another unique matchup that's only happened once before, Oklahoma State and Oregon. So they've played one time before in 2008, and so this is the first time they've played in almost, in history, but the last time was 20 years ago nearly. So it's going to be an interesting matchup. Oklahoma State didn't do too hot last year, so it'll be a big test for them, and hopefully they can hold their own. So Illinois at Duke, and Baylor at SMU. Those are both kind of measuring stick games. How does Illinois look and Duke? Duke is going to be, are they still competitive? Are they going to have another competitive year where they push every team that they play and give them fits? Is Illinois going to be, like what they were last year, coming off a 10-win season? Are they going to be back in that picture, pushing for a playoff spot? Baylor and SMU, how's Dave Aranda at Baylor? Have they continue to improve? They're being patient with him there, so they clearly see something in that program and from him as a coach. So how's Baylor improving? How are the Bears doing? SMU, kind of again, are you gonna make another push? Are you gonna push again for the conference title? Or are you gonna make it back to the playoff? These are two teams that could be pretty good, could be pretty bad in their conferences. So that's a good measuring stick game, but that'll do it for this week and for this show. I really appreciate you listening. If you did, make sure you follow on X, subscribe to the YouTube channel, follow the podcasts, Campus Pigskin. Anyways, College Football Podcast. Thanks for listening.